Welcome to our discussion on measuring public opinion. Here are the topics for today's discussion. What are traditional public opinion polls? What are examples of specific types of political polls? What are the shortcomings of polls? And what impact does polling have on politicians, politics, and policy? To start us off with, here are a couple terms that will help us understand polling a little bit better. Politicians at all levels, state, local, national, use a variety of measures as indicators of public opinion to guide their policy decisions. And one of the things that features most prominently in polling is approval ratings, which is a percentage determined by polling, which indicates the percentage of respondents to an opinion poll who approve of a particular person or program. They're a very valuable commodity that politicians want to know approval ratings, interest groups want to know approval ratings, elected officials often use approval ratings to determine how to act. So now that we know what approval ratings are, there are three traditional public opinion polling phases, so three stages in traditional public opinion polling. Polls are used to determine information. So politically, that could be things like, have you ever heard of a candidate, a specific candidate? Does that candidate have good name recognition? Would candidate X be a good candidate for president? How does the public respond to a particular ad that's on TV or the radio? So here are three stages to the public opinion survey or a poll. Number one, determining the content and phrasing of the questions. This can be very important because responses can be skewed depending on the wording of the question. Number two, selecting the sample. This is a very fundamentally important part of public opinion polling. Universal polling is not practical. It's not practical to ask every single person who lives in an area a question. The numbers are just too large. To do it on a national scale would be mind-boggling. It can't happen. So sampling has to be done. And in sampling, random sampling, I guess in theory, would be the best way to sample, where each person has an equal probability of being selected for the poll. But exhaustive lists that incorporate the names of every person in an area, are very hard to come by. So oftentimes random sampling is not possible either, just like universal sampling. So there are some other methods that pollsters use to try to come up with a good representative sample. And one of those is a straw poll, which is unscientific. We learned about it in the previous discussion. It's unrepresentative sampling. It asks viewers for their opinions, and that can happen on TV or the internet. And those with strong opinions tend to participate, tend to vote in these straw polls. So they're not exactly scientific. Another type of sampling is called quota sampling. If the pollsters draw their sample based on known statistics, so some demographic information about a city could lead to polling that's broken down by demographics. And one other type of sampling could be stratified sampling, which is a variation on random sampling. It uses census data to divide the country into 4 different regions, and then researchers select counties and metro areas in proportion to the national population. So it uses pre-existing census data to come up with a more rigorous sampling technique. And the third phase of traditional public opinion polling is the contacting of respondents. How are they contacted? In person? Are they asked as they walk down the hallway in a mall? It turns out that asking people questions in person, face-to-face, can influence the way that they answer the question as well. Asking them to call in, doing it by phone. Before cell phones came into existence, doing it by phone was fairly easy. Something like 95% of American households had a landline, but now cell phone use makes that harder because it's more difficult to know what people's cell phone numbers are rather than just looking in the phone book. So here are a couple examples of specific political polls. There's a competition to get the most up-to-date data for politicians. Knowledge is power. Now, the first example is a push poll. And these are polls with an ulterior motive. They are taken for the purpose of providing information on an opponent that would lead respondents to vote against that candidate. They're designed to push the public away from a candidate's opponent and towards the candidate who's paying for the poll. The results aren't even considered. They aren't recorded because the question is all that matters. Because the question is designed to taint the reputation of the opponent. So here's perhaps an outlandish example, but if you knew candidate X beat his wife, would you vote for him? The results don't matter because the question says it all. And the internet could be drastically changing the way push polling is done. It's a pretty good example of spin. Tracking polls are another type of political polling. Continuous surveys that allow campaigns to chart the daily activity. So campaigns can monitor short-term campaign developments, who's up, who's down. This contributes to something called horse race journalism, which is the tendency of the media to focus on who is winning at the expense of covering the issues. So focusing solely on candidate X is ahead by 3 points instead of focusing on the actual issues. It could be happening at the expense of debates and the actual issues in the campaign. And this can create the bandwagon effect. Here's an example of a tracking poll. So these are almost daily. And you can see from March to October in the 2004 presidential election. So focusing on the ups and the downs of the different campaigns rather than the substance that the campaigns offer. Exit polls. Polls conducted at selecting polling places on election day. They're used to predict the outcome of key races. They can be tricky, though, for national polls, like the presidential polls, with different time zones. Now there's an agreement that networks aren't supposed to make predictions before all polling places close. In 1980, Jimmy Carter had declared defeat. He had conceded the election to Ronald Reagan 3 hours before all polling places were closed in the United States. And some people felt like doing that disincentivized voters in the West Coast from voting. And sometimes exit polls can be wrong. Like Florida was called for Gore in 2000 based on exit polling that turned out to be incorrect when the real numbers came out. Now here are the shortcomings of polls. They can be riddled with error. One of those errors is called a sampling error, which is also known as a margin of error. It's the difference between the actual and the actual universe, the real result, and the sample that the poll predicted. All polls are going to have error, but a good sample size of about 1,000 to 1,500 can get a fairly good estimate. A 3% margin of error would mean that 51% to 49% is too close to call. That 51% could be anywhere from 54 to 48%, and that 49% could be anywhere from 52 to 46%. So any one of those permutations could lead to that race being too close to call. Here are some other shortcomings of polls. If there's limited respondent options, for example, it's a yes or a no, they're only given 2 choices, the results may vary or they might not reveal everything that the public is thinking. A lack of information. If the voters don't have much knowledge or strong opinion about a topic, then the responses can be skewed. Some polls get around this by using a filter question to gauge how much people know. And then intensity. Some polls don't give respondents an opportunity to express how strongly they feel, which could again give politicians in the poll a different result. What are the impacts of polling on politics? All government rests on public opinion. Public opinion can fluctuate, though, making it hard to gauge. Does polling weaken democracy? Shouldn't the outcome of a debate or a discussion force a politician to take a position, not some passive sample that they've gotten from a poll? Polls can also create a bandwagon effect, especially when we get into presidential elections with this thing called front-loading. A strong showing in an early poll can give a campaign a boost, and at the same time, a weak showing can provide a setback to a campaign, which can be very, very tough to recover from. So it creates this aura where it's so important to look like a winner early on, and it's almost impossible in some cases to recover from a weak showing in an early poll. So this could make campaigns more about looking like a winner rather than the debates and the substance of a campaign. It could be more about an image that's projected rather than the substance. All right, that takes us to the end of this discussion. Hope it helped. Good luck studying.